All right. So in this context, last time I was talking about, well, John's vision of the High Christ, and this is taken from Jung's essay, which is called The Mass and the Individuation Process, originally published in Psychology and Religion and republished in Murray Stein's Jung on Christianity, which I'm going through. And I've done 2 videos on this so far and gotten to page 44, 144. I have 10 pages to go, which is probably going to be another 2 videos. This is probably going to be the third of 4. And I'm essentially going to continue straight on. So we were talking about this Jung's idea of the self as a kind of like ego to self is kind of like earth to sun. So the ego orbits around the self in a certain way. And the self is this center of personality, which is between conscious and unconscious. And in some ways in Jung's system, it's the equivalent term to God in a sense. And so we were talking about this, like Christ is a symbol of the self for Jung, and then John's vision in Acts of John, the apocryphal Acts of John, of the High Christ, this cross of light. And it was very dramatic, mystical vision that Jung was interpreting in, well, the Jungian language. And so we were talking about these mirrored crucifixes, an upper metaphysical and lower earthly sort of event, and that it's very tempting to value one over and above the other, to put all the significance on the actual earthly crucifixion of Christ, or in fact on this sort of upper metaphysical event, and therefore to devalue his actual crucifixion. And so the revelation of this cross, which I was talking about as a kind of ingression from high dimension, is one way to understand it, was described as a kind of signifying order, bringing organization to chaos. It functions as an organizing center. And we see this in like the symbols of the mandala. And so the idea for Jung is that these symbols, which appear in dreams, but also appear in the form of, such as the revelation that we're discussing, are symbols of the self. So they're what Jung would call a God image, pointing to that self. And so there's these symbols or this kind of revelation. It serves as a kind of intermediary or bridge. It's when we can participate in the symbol by holding the deep relationship with it between subject and object that Jung was describing, then that symbol can serve as a bridge to what we could call God, or what Jung would call the self. And so revelation or image is not God itself, it is an image of the self. And so in that context, we were talking about this symbol of the sort of 4-dimensional crucifix. And it's in the context of this primordial image of God with a circle and a dot in the middle, divided into 4 in the mandala. The idea that these kinds of symbols naturally emerge cross-culturally in modern times and in all times. So we're going to read the last couple of paragraphs that we were talking about, and then we'll continue on into what Peter has to say, namely Saint Peter. It goes into an extended quote from him and then talks about that. Okay, so Jung said, this is paragraph 433. The cross signifies order as opposed to the disorderly chaos of the formless multitude. It is, in fact, one of the prime symbols of order, as I've shown elsewhere. In the domain of psychological processes, it functions as an organizing center. And in states of psychic disorder, caused by an invasion of unconscious contents, it appears as a mandala divided into 4. No doubt this was a frequent phenomenon in early Christian times, and not only in Gnostic circles. Gnostic introspection could hardly fail, therefore, to perceive the numinosity of this archetype and be duly impressed by it. For the Gnostics, the cross had exactly the same function that the Atman or self has always had for the East. This realization is one of the central experiences of Gnosticism. Okay, so to summarize that, I think it would be fair to say that the cross essentially is a revelation which brings order to chaos. It functions as an organizing center of the psyche, and the idea being, of course, as per the argument last time, that it can serve as this in groups, in the context of group process and community life, in the context of, for example, communion. So it functions as an organizing center, I would say both within and without. I would call it a transjective center, although Jung doesn't use the language of transjectivity. It appears in the form of a mandala, especially when the unconscious sort of invades consciousness. So it can appear involuntarily in this way, but also sort of, you could say, in normal life through dreams. And so Jung's idea is that no wonder this sort of thing impressed the Gnostics because it's so numinous in that way. And it's kind of equivalent, its numinosity is equivalent to the numinosity of Atman, or quote, the self in the East. And again, that definition of the self is different than Jung's definition of the self. Complicated, so we won't get stuck on that. Jung then says, the definition of the cross or center as the boundary of all things is exceedingly original, for it suggests that the limits of the universe are not to be found in a non-existent periphery, but in its center. There alone lies the possibility of transcending this world. All instability culminates in that which is unchanging and quiescent. And in the self, all disharmonies are resolved in the quote, harmony of wisdom. So here we have the idea that the self is a kind of unchanging center, that there is an eternality which is in the center of being rather than at the periphery of our world. So the idea is that the self is actually, I would say, the self and then this symbols, for example, the symbol of the crucifix as a symbol of the self, that this is actually the limit of the universe. And this is what I meant by kind of ingression from a, you could say, higher dimension, but that's just another label that we have, right? So the idea that the crucifix is a limit of our universe and a manifestation of a hyperdimensional reality. And this radically changes the sort of religious orientation in a sense. It's like we're oriented then toward the center, which is in itself unchanging and which harmonizes all disharmony, rather than sort of continually trying to explore toward an ever receding edge of the universe, which we can never reach. Okay, then Jung says, as the center symbolizes the idea of totality and finality, it's quite appropriate that the text should suddenly start speaking of the dichotomy of the universe, polarized into right and left, bright and darkness, heaven and the nether root, the mother of all. This is a clear reminder that everything is contained in the center, and that as a result, the Lord, i.e., the cross, unites and composes all things, and is therefore nirvana, free from the opposites, in conformity with Eastern ideas and also with the psychology of this archetypal symbol. Okay, and so Jung goes on, but what I want to say about this is that it's not quite clear what Jung means here. Like, why should there be a connection between this idea of totality or finality and that of speaking in dichotomy? And for Jung, like I found a different quote in a different essay, which is that I'm just going to find that. All right, well, I thought I paused that, but I didn't. Anyway, I'm going to keep going. I found it. It's in a footnote in Problems of Alchemy, which is at the beginning of Psychology and Alchemy. And it says, the only statements that have psychological validity concerning the God image are either paradoxes or antinomies. So Jung feels that it's sort of only valid to speak of the God image in terms of paradox. And so when we speak of that which is total or final or whole, Jung is speaking about the self or about God. And he feels that it's sort of only valid to talk about that in terms of paradox. And this is why he feels that it's natural that the text should start speaking in dichotomy, quote, should start speaking of the dichotomy of the universe, polarized into right and left, brightness and darkness, heaven and the nether root, the mother of all. And the idea of the center symbolizes that which is total and final. Yeah, so there's a way that that center, as a symbol of totality, sort of contains and unites all things and is free from the opposites in a certain way. All right, so he goes on. The Gnostic Christ figure and the cross are counterparts of the typical mandalas, spontaneously produced by the unconscious. They are natural symbols, and they differ fundamentally from the dogmatic figure of Christ, in whom all trace of darkness is expressly lacking. So he talks about this difference between the more dogmatic figure of Christ, who's regarded as a perfect image, a symbol of perfection, and the Gnostic Christ figure, which he argues is a symbol of a self, a symbol of wholeness or totality, which is different than perfection. Again, this was gone into in great detail in the first 5 episodes in this series, which were on chapter 5 from Ion, which go into Christ as a symbol of the self and the difference between perfection and wholeness in that context. So these natural symbols, such as those of the mandala, those of the cross, those of Christ as a symbol of totality, arise naturally from the unconscious and in the form of revelation. And the perfection of Christ is, according to Jung, not equal to the wholeness that that figure is designed to represent. So there's a way that, ironically, Christ is a sort of imperfect figure because he's perfect. By being perfect, he, in Jung's terms, sort of lacks a dark side and therefore isn't a full expression of, isn't as faithful a symbol of totality as could be. Jung would say something like that. Anyway, so now we're going to quote from Peter, which is the start of the new content. So Jung says, in this connection, mention should be made of Peter's valedictory words, which he spoke during his martyrdom. He was crucified upside down at his own request. So St. Peter ended up being crucified just like Christ around the time of Christ, although a little bit later, and he requested to be crucified upside down. And then Peter talks about what that means. And it's a long quote, and it says, O name of the cross, hidden mystery, O grace ineffable that is pronounced in the name of the cross. O nature of man that cannot be separated from God. O love unspeakable and indivisible that cannot be shown forth by unclean lips. I grasp thee now, I that am at the end of my earthly course. I will declare thee as thou art. I will not keep silent the mystery of the cross, which was once shut and hidden from my soul. You that hope in Christ, let not the cross be for you, let not the cross be for you that which appears. You that hope in Christ, let not the cross be for you that which appears, for it is another thing, and different from that which appears. This suffering, which is in accordance with Christ's. And now, above all, because you that can hear are able to hear it of me, who am at the last and farewell hour of my life, Hearken. Separate your souls from everything that is of the senses, from everything that appears to be, but in truth is not. Lock your eyes, close your ears, shun those happenings which are seen. Then you shall perceive that which was done to Christ, and the whole mystery of your salvation. Learn the mystery of all nature. Learn the mystery of all nature, and the beginning of all things, as it was. For the first man, of whose race I bear the likeness, fell head downwards, and showed forth a manner of birth, such as had not existed till then. For it was dead, having no motion. And being pulled downwards, and having also cast his origin upon the earth, he established the whole disposition of things. For being hanged up in the manner appointed, he showed forth the things of the right as those of the left, and the things of the left as those of the right, and changed about all the marks of their nature, so that things that were not fair were perceived to be fair, and those that were in truth evil were perceived to be good. Wherefore the Lord says in a mystery, quote, "Except ye make the things of the right as those of the left, and those of the left as those of the right, and those that are above as those below, and those that are behind as those that are before, ye shall not have knowledge of the kingdom. This understanding have I brought you, and the figure in which you now see me hanging is the representation of that first man who came to birth." I'm going to repeat the last passages because it's quite a difficult quotation. Again, he said, "And now above all, because you that can hear me are able to hear it of me, who am at the last and farewell hour of my life, hearken. Separate your souls from everything that is of the senses, from everything that appears to be, but in truth is not. Lock your eyes, close your ears, shun those happenings which are seen. Then you shall perceive that which was done to Christ, and the whole mystery of your salvation. Learn the mystery of all nature, and the beginning of all things, as it was. For the first man, of whose race I bear the likeness, fell head downwards, and showed forth a manner of birth, such as had not existed till then. For it was dead, having no motion. And being pulled downwards, and having also cast his origin upon the earth, he established the whole disposition of things. For being hanged up in the manner appointed, he showed forth the things of the right as those of the left, and the things of the left as those of the right, and changed about all the marks of their nature, so that things that were not fair were perceived to be fair, and those that were in truth evil were perceived to be good. Wherefore the Lord says in mystery, quote, "Except ye make the things of the right as those of the left, and those of the left as those of the right, and those that are above as those below, and those that are behind as those that are before, ye shall not have the knowledge of the kingdom." This understanding have I brought you, and the figure in which you now see me hanging is the representation of that first man who came to birth. So it's a rather complex idea, and it's the idea that Christ in some way corresponds to the second Adam, and that his crucifixion is also well, it's a symbol of death, resurrection, and rebirth, as we quite famously know, right? And so the birth aspect is that there's a way that um, Christ's crucifixion and the birth that symbolically represents, that goes along with that crucifixion, includes a kind of conversion into the opposite, as we quote, establishing the whole disposition of things. St. Peter telling us quite explicitly to learn the mystery of nature and to learn the beginning of all things, the origin. So there's a way that I think this corresponds. I think this idea is that in what is called original sin, so like the birth of Adam, the origin of our, you could call delusion or deformation of the soul, our fallenness. There's a way that we've become deluded or that we misperceive things. And the idea is that um, to convert things into the opposite, to yeah, there's a way that to undertake the task that Christ is recommending is a way to sort of restore things into their original and in some way opposite condition, and that this can have the effect of redeeming the soul, essentially. And furthermore, we have the idea that the form of Peter's crucifixion represents the birth of who have called Adam, the first man here. And so now Jung is going to comment on this. It's a short paragraph and then there's another short quote and then he keeps going. And so again, I might just invoke from the last video, we were talking about these mirrored crucifixes. An upper and a lower crucifix. So Christ's literal physical crucifixion is sort of the lower earthly event that in some way corresponds with a higher metaphysical spiritual event. And that this theme is drawn out also in this passage of Peter's. Again, his valedictory words. So Jung says, in this passage too, the symbolical interpretation of the cross is coupled with the problem of opposites. First, in the unusual idea that the creation of the first man caused everything to be turned upside down. And then in the attempt to unite the opposites by identifying them with one another. A further point of significance is that Peter, crucified head downwards, is identical not only with the first created man, but with the cross. Okay, so a couple of complex ideas there. Firstly, the idea that we're trying to interpret or understand symbolically what the cross is, and that interpretation, that understanding is coupled with this problem of opposites that we've been discussing. Again, we had this unusual idea that the creation of the first man and the sort of original sin or fallenness that went along with that caused everything to be, in a way, turned upside down. And the idea is that by working with different pairs of opposites, that this condition can be corrected in some way. And I think I would talk about that not simply as a um, conversion into the opposite, but there's a way that, again, if we can work with both halves of a polarity, a duality, then in some sense it can be transcended, which corresponds with this sort of quote, attempt to unite the opposites by identifying them with one another. So it's a practice, which is a recognition and a facility with the opposites themselves, so that we don't get stuck in either end of any polarity. But if we notice that things go in binaries, then that noticing is itself the work of liberation. And it's difficult. Hence requiring work with the unconscious, is what Jung would say. Yep, and then we finally had the idea that Peter is, by requesting to be crucified in an upside down way, corresponds with that nature of the cross. Not only identical with the first created man, but also with the cross. So then he says, quote, "For what else is Christ but the word, the sound of God, For what else is Christ but the Word, the sound of God? So the Word is this upright beam on which I'm crucified, and the sound is the beam which crosses it, the nature of man. But the nail which holds the center of the crossbeam to the upright is man's conversion and repentance. Again, for what else is Christ but the Word, the sound of God? So the Word is this upright beam on which I am crucified, and the sound is the beam which crosses it, the nature of man. But the nail which holds the center of the crossbeam to the upright is man's conversion and repentance. Okay, so again, this stuff is difficult, and Jung's then going to talk about that difficulty and about what it means. He says, in the light of these passages, it can hardly be said that the author of the Acts of John, presumably a Gnostic, has drawn the necessary conclusions from his premises, or that their full implications have become clear to him. So Jung feels that the people who wrote this text didn't understand, didn't draw the right conclusions, and that the full implications of this kind of vision, the one that we were talking about last time, and these words of Peter's, have not been reached, have not become known. He also feels that those implications are significant. He says, on the contrary, one gets the impression that the light has swallowed up everything dark. Quote, just as the enlightening vision appears high above the actual scene of crucifixion. So for John, the enlightened one stands high above the formless multitude. So again, this is pointing out a key dynamic in these different visions, the words of Peter and also the mystical vision that we were discussing last time. And I'm going to quote the relevant part, which said, quote, and with these words, he showed me a cross of light, and about the cross, a great multitude that had no form. And in the cross, there was one form and one appearance. And it's then said later on, now the formless multitude about the cross is of the lower nature. And so what Jung is pointing to here is the idea that there is still imbalance in these visions. There's a way that the authors, indeed we could, I think Jung is suggesting John himself, is sort of distracted by the upper half, the light half, the revelation of the mystical vision, and de-emphasizing the lower and dark half, namely the brutality of the actual crucifixion, for example. And this is why he said, in the light of these passages, it can hardly be said that the author of the Acts of John, presumably a Gnostic, has drawn the necessary conclusions from his premises, or that their full implications have become clear to him. On the contrary, one gets the impression that the light has swallowed up everything dark, just as the enlightening vision appears high above the actual scene of crucifixion, So for John, the enlightened one stands high above the formless multitude. The text says, quote, therefore care not for the many, and despise those that are outside the mystery. And Jung says, this overweening attitude arises from an inflation caused by the fact that the enlightened John has identified with his own light and confused his self with the ego. Confuse his ego with the self. Therefore, he feels superior to the darkness in him. Therefore, he feels superior to the darkness in him. He forgets that light only has a meaning when it illuminates something dark, and that his enlightenment is no good to him unless it helps him to recognize his own darkness. If the powers of the left are as real as those of the right, then their union can only produce a third thing that shares the nature of both. Okay, so Jung basically feels that there's a kind of imbalance that is still present in the visions that we've been discussing, and that this imbalance corresponds with a preferencing or priority for the transcendent, for the mystical, for the high, for the spiritual, for unity, and a corresponding devaluation of the earthly, of the actual, of the sensory, of the many rather than the one. And he feels that this results from a certain inflation by which one identifies with the mystical vision, identifies with the self, particularly, rather than recognizing the reality of the limitations of the ego. And that the consequence of this inflation is that one's own darkness is forgotten and it results in a kind of hubris or arrogance, which Jung calls overweening attitude, resulting in quotes like, therefore care not for the many and despise those that are outside the mystery. So John forgets his own darkness. I think we can certainly see why this is quite likely given the revelation of the vision. Like it's certainly understandable, but it's true that the whole point of mystical visions like that is that they when the meaning of enlightenment is that it illuminates something dark. I won't go into discussing the ins and outs of mystical experience right here. I'm going to continue following what Jung is talking about. So I guess the moral of that particular story or conclusion that Jung has drawn is that we want to be super careful of inflation in the context of trying to talk about uh, revelatory experiences such as those that involve the cross, Christ, or the self, because identifying with that will result in a kind of arrogance, which is stemming from a kind of Luciferian pride or inflation. Yep. And so Jung points out that the whole point of the prescription that the powers of the left and the powers of the right are both sort of equally real, the whole point of recognizing things in this way is that the union of the two can involve the production of a third that shares the nature of both. I mean, as a quick example, Aristotle has this great example of the tension on a bow. We're talking about the word tonos or creative tension, where both sides of the bow, both ends of the bow are necessary to be able to fire an arrow on the third dimension. And this requires, for Jung, it requires integrating the darkness, not prioritizing the light, because they, as an example of one of the pairs of opposites, go together. And then he says, opposites unite in a new energy potential. The third that arises out of their union is a figure free from the opposites, beyond all moral categories. What he means by that is that it's not necessarily accurate to describe that which is beyond all opposites as good or evil, because it would rightfully be both and neither. And then he said, this conclusion would have been too advanced for the Gnostics. So there's a way that the implications, the consequences that Jung has drawn out of these passages are so significant or impactful that he felt that the people who wrote these visions, who recorded them, weren't able to grok them, weren't able to get that. He said, yeah, this conclusion would have been too advanced for the Gnostics, recognizing the danger of Gnostic irrealism. So again, the Gnostic angle or the Gnostic disposition here would be prioritizing the mystical vision and the direct knowledge or gnosis that it would reveal, and would be de-emphasizing the correspondence between the upper metaphysical event of the sort of spiritual crucifixion corresponding with the actual physical, literal crucifixion. So when he says Gnostic irrealism, there's a way that it prioritizes that which is not actual. It prioritizes the transcendent in a way. That's what Jung means. So he says, recognizing the danger of Gnostic irrealism, the church, more practical in these matters, has always insisted on the concretism of the historical events, despite the fact that the original New Testament texts predict the ultimate deification of man in a manner strangely reminiscent of the words of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, quote, "Ye shall be as gods." Genesis 3:5. Nevertheless, there was some justification for postponing the elevation of man's status until after death, as this avoided the danger of Gnostic inflation. Okay, so there's a couple of things here. There's a way that the attitude of the early church was contra the Gnostic attitude, and therefore the church was saying, no, it really happened. The crucifixion was a real, physical, literal, actual event that concretely occurred in real historical time. And this emphasis is very much the emphasis on, it's a practical emphasis. It's an emphasis on historicity. It's not an emphasis on the direct knowing of the quote unquote higher Christ event, which is what the Gnostics were emphasizing. And this emphasis, Jung points out that there seems to be a contradiction between this emphasis on the real historical fact of the crucifixion and the quote from Genesis, "Ye shall become as gods," because this seems to imply a Gnostic direction, meaning going up toward transcendence or liberation. And he says that in some way, yeah, so there's a kind of contradiction in the sense that they're emphasizing the concretism of the historical crucifixion, but then the New Testament is also predicting the ultimate deification of man, in a sense. I don't think so. Those don't have to be in contradiction, as Jung said. It can be this union of opposites that he's himself is talking about. And again, he points out that there is a very real justification for postponing this idea that we elevate in some way to the condition of gods. This is the New Testament prediction of the ultimate deification of man, but that happens after death, meaning in the next life, in heaven, let's say, not in this worldly life. And that one of the reasons for emphasizing this mythology is that it, quote, avoids the danger of Gnostic inflation. So if we have to grapple with the reality of transcendence and mystical experience and direct knowledge of God in this life, then it's very easy to become inflated, as Jung claims John was. And so then we would have to deal with the risk of inflation properly to account for that. And I think the answer would be the chop wood, carry water down and among prescription and the heavily sociologically bounded forms of sacramental practice, so that we're less at the risk of going up and away. Yeah, I think again, if this is in the context of an ecology of practices that is designed to help us gain facility with different pairs of opposites, for example, by practicing the skill of perspective taking, so that we can get a perspective on any of the different polarities that beset us, then the idea would be if we really understand that, if we can really understand that any quality is derivative, any definition is partial, and that God can only be spoken of in paradox or antinomy, then what we gain with that understanding is that we understand that we need to, like, if we go in a certain direction, then that direction is only always going to be partial. So we also have to go in the opposite direction. If it's So the idea would be that the thing is that understanding, even the understanding that God is beyond all opposites, can only get us so far. But I think for me, it's I can at least say, understanding aside, I can clearly see from this point that the context of the ecology of practices in a community of practitioners with a viable worldview, trying to chop wood and carry water, that this is all guardrails. That's all training wheels. That's all necessary in order to avoid the one-dimensional, one-directional up and out tendencies. So either in terms of a mythologizing that we can't rationally believe in anymore, or in terms of a Gnostic inflation or any other kind of inflation. I'm saying that solutions to these problems can be sociologically and practically designed. And that should be deadly obvious, I think. So we're looking to, this is a kind of Chesterton's fence thing. We're looking at some of the function of what the mythology was serving. It was serving to help us avoid inflation and stay grounded in this actual real world. We want to replace that functionality with alternatives. Okay, moving on. Jung then says, had the Gnostic not identified with the self, again, this is self versus ego kind of thing, where self is the God image and the inflation is the identity with the self. So Jung says, had the Gnostic not identified with the self, he would have been bound to see how much darkness was in him. A realization that comes more naturally to modern man, but causes him no less difficulties. Indeed, he is far more likely to assume that he himself is wholly of the devil than to believe that God could ever indulge in paradoxical statements. For all the ill consequences of his fatal inflation, the Gnostic did, however, gain an insight into religion, or into the psychology of religion, from which we can still learn a thing or two today. He looked deep into the background of Christianity, and hence into its future developments. This he could do because his intimate connection with pagan Gnosis made him an assimilator that helped him to integrate the Christian message into the spirit of the times. Okay, this is again rather complex. So firstly, there's the idea that when one is faced with the quote unquote revelation of the self or of Christ or of the cross or of the logos or revelation, when one is faced with revelation, it's in some way much easier to simply identify with that self rather than to notice our evil. So there's a way that we are sorely lacking in we're sort of beset with worldly conditions, the human condition, which includes evil and suffering and so on. And there's a way that when revelation is introduced into that context, the easiest and most immediate thing to do from that point is simply to identify with the revelation and say that that's true and all of this is sort of fake, unreal, not true. This is like the Matrix sort of Gnosticism. And so um, to sort of account for that, there's a sort of general idea that gnosis can serve to unlock a kind of spaciousness. It's a kind of spiritual resourcing. So it opens a certain space within that wasn't open before. And from out of that spaciousness, it's possible to look in a different way, and indeed in a way which is more clear, more truthful, at the suffering and evil, which is the reality. So it can be a way of being with more deeply that which is real and true and actual. So it doesn't have to result in inflation. So Jung claims that for the early Gnostic, it was quite difficult to, they really didn't want to see the darkness in themselves, and that in some way it's easier for, or more natural for modern people to realize that darkness, but that it's still difficult for us to do so. And sort of partly because of the lack of gnosis, the lack of access to direct experience of God or the self, there's a way that we take everything upon ourselves, which is kind of the opposite. We kind of assume that we're wholly the product of the devil rather than to believe that, rather than noticing that God is in fact beyond opposites and therefore we are both good and evil. So there's a way that the evil quality of our nature is more obvious to modern people, but this still causes us no end of difficulties. And so there's a way that we are not quite so often exposed to the risk of inflation that Jung claims that the Gnostic is at risk of, but that in some way we have the um, opposite risk in some way, which is to deny our own divinity. So the prescription is obviously to remember our own divinity, to understand the proper functionality of gnosis in sustainable culture, not for the sake of inflation, but for the sake of inner spaciousness with from out of which we can be with ourselves more deeply. And so the whole point of gnosis is that there is this risk of inflation, but that it also has a certain affordance. That there are certain affordances that go along with Gnostic insight. And then Jung describes some of what those affordances or insights are, namely that one can look into both the past and the future of the religious tradition. And that the quality of gnosis allows for assimilation. It allows one to take on the role of assimilator. What that means is that the Christian message, which is in some sense the source of the revelation, is the Christian message in a way that's able to be integrated into the spirit of the times, meaning this time, in the context of the past and the future, if we're seeing things clearly. So there's a way that that gnosis can help us to see things more clearly and to integrate the messages of the Christian faith into the spirit of the times and not result in inflation. But obviously, there's still that risk. Okay, again, it's quite complex, right? There's a lot going on. Okay, then Jung says, the extraordinary number of synonyms piled on top of one another in an attempt to define the cross have their analogy in the Nicene and periadic symbols of Hippolytus, all pointing to this one center. He gives a Greek term, which is the kind of corresponding term in alchemy, the center. But I don't know what the Greek term is. But he says that it's, on the one hand, the heart and governing principle of the macrocosm, and on the other hand, its reflection in a point, in a microcosm, such as man has always been thought to be. Okay, and just to briefly review this, there were many, many synonyms that were used to attempt to define the cross uh, in the vision of John that we were talking about. Namely, quote, for your sakes, this cross of light was named by me now Logos, now Nous, now Jesus, now Christ, now door, now way, now bread, now seed, now resurrection, now Son, now Father, now pneuma, now life, now truth, now faith, now grace. So it is called for men, but in itself and in its essence is spoken of to you, it is the boundary of all things, and the composing of things unstable, and the harmony of wisdom and the wisdom that is in harmony. Okay. And so this is what Jung is talking about now. He's talking about how all of these different synonyms are used to describe, try to describe this thing, which is in some ways beyond description, beyond definition. And now he's saying that these synonyms, they all have analogies in the quote, Nicene and Peratic symbols of Hippolytus, which all point to the same quote center. And this alchemical symbolism and alchemical language is, according to Jung, pointing to the same thing, the uh, the quote inner nature of man, which we could understand as the self. And so he says, quote of man, he is of the same essence as the universe, and his own midpoint is its center. This inner experience, shared by Gnostics, alchemists, and mystics alike, has to do with the nature of the unconscious. One could even say that it is the experience of the unconscious. For the unconscious, though its objective existence and its influence on consciousness cannot be doubted, is in itself undifferentiable and therefore unknowable. So Jung is here referring to a kind of inner experience, and that is the kind of inner experience that oneself is of the same essence of the universe, and that his own midpoint is its center. We see this, for example, in Meister Eckhart. And Jung feels that this is an experience of the unconscious as such, or can be conceived in that way. And it can be conceived in that way because the unconscious is kind of undifferentiable and unknowable. And so, to summarize, all the attempts to define the cross, such as we saw in the vision of John, they all point to the center of ourselves and the center of the universe. And when we experience that center in this way that's beyond description, beyond definition, beyond opposites, it's a kind of inner experience. Again, it's an experience that where there's corresponding inner and outer dimensions, the inner aspect of which is emphasized here. It's an inner experience which is shared by many from many different traditions and styles. And that kind of experience concerns what Jung calls the nature of the unconscious. So he feels that there's something natural about that. And it has to do with these paradoxical qualities and this indefinable nature of the unconscious, which in a way lend it to such experience. Hoping that's reasonably clear, he then says, hypothetical germs of differentiation may be conjectured to exist in it, the unconscious, but their existence cannot be proved because everything appears to be in a state of mutual contamination. So everything's mixed together in the unconscious. The unconscious gives the impression of multiplicity and unity at once. Again, because it's beyond opposites in a certain way. It's a little tricky here because there's a way that the self is in some way equated with the unconscious, but I think he would say, again, the self is a center of personality which is between conscious and unconscious, or has conscious and unconscious aspects. And these dynamics of the unconscious are therefore at play when we experience the self. So it's a symbol of totality, the center of our whole being. And so we can attain a conscious sense of this self. The idea would be in group process, not just individually, but that it nevertheless gives paradoxical impressions, such as being beyond, but also including unity and multiplicity at once. So I would say that Jung is talking about these qualities of the unconscious here in this context, in the connection that such qualities appear in experiences of God or of the self. Okay, he says, however overwhelmed we may be by the vast quantity of things differentiated in time and space, we know from the world of the senses that the validity of its laws extends to immense distances. We therefore believe that it is one and the same universe throughout, in its smallest part as in its greatest. So Jung's here saying that since the senses that we have, they confirm the laws of the universe, and hence we believe that universe to be a kind of unified whole, no matter how chaotic it appears to us. Then he says, on the other hand, the intellect always tries to discern differences because it cannot discriminate without them. Consequently, the unity of the cosmos remains for it a somewhat nebulous postulate, which it doesn't rightly know what to do with. Okay, so Jung here is presenting the idea that we have a sort of latent awareness of the unity of all things. And one of the ways that we understand that unity is, for example, that we have this complexity that comes to our senses, but we understand that the laws that obtain in the world of the senses, they extend through the whole universe. And so we do understand, even though everything is chaotic and complex, that it's unified. But Jung is saying that this sense of unity is in some way unconscious or latent, and that the faculty of our consciousness tends toward the discrimination of opposites, the discrimination of difference via the intellect. The intellect does this. And so Jung is arguing that thanks to the intellect, the sense of the unity that we hold within us is difficult to grasp, often difficult to grasp. So he's talking more in this theme of conscious and unconscious and how the different dynamics of each. So there seems to be a kind of unconscious unity and more of a conscious multiplicity, even though there's very much multiplicity also within the unconscious. And even though we can notice that things are unified in the conscious world too. Tricky, tricky, tricky. So he says, consequently, the unity of the cosmos remains, for it, the intellect, a somewhat nebulous postulate which it doesn't rightly know what to do with. It's kind of like we know that everything's unified, but we don't know what to do with that fact. Then he says, but as soon as introspection starts penetrating into the psychic background, it comes up against the unconscious, which, unlike consciousness, shows only the barest traces of any definite contents, surprising the investigator at every turn with a confusing medley of relationships, parallels, contaminations, and identifications. Although he is forced for epistemological reasons to postulate an indefinite number of distinct and separate archetypes, yet he is constantly overcome by doubt as to how far they are really distinguishable from one another. They overlap to such a degree and have such a capacity for combination that all attempts to isolate them conceptually must appear hopeless. In addition, the unconscious, in sharpest contrast to consciousness and its contents, has a tendency to personify itself in a uniform way, just as if it possessed only one shape or one voice. Because of this peculiarity, the unconscious conveys an experience of unity, to which are due all those qualities enumerated by the Gnostics and the alchemists, and a lot more besides. Again, this is a really difficult passage. So what is Jung talking about here? We have this sort of latent sense of a unity of all things, but when we start to look within, we encounter this complex, chaotic multiplicity, which we see in the observation that the archetypes overlap and they combine and they mix. So the unconscious is confusing and difficult to access, and it includes both multiplicity and unity. And even though we try to define the archetypes as distinct from one another, in practical terms, it's not really like that. Moreover, there's also a tendency that the unconscious has to appear in the guise of uniformity, quote, just as if it possessed only one shape or one voice. And so in this way, it sort of conveys an experience of unity, even though there's complexity and multiplicity there also. Again, it's paradoxical and capable quite easily of including both. One way to understand that is simply in the experience. We can understand that there's possibility to access the experience of unity or the experience of multiplicity, and no reason why those need to contradict. And so one way to kind of sort of very briefly summarize, I think, what Jung's saying is that the conscious world sort of appears as a chaotic multiplicity, but is in reality unified. We feel that we know this. Whereas the unconscious sort of appears in a unified way, but is in fact chaotic and multiplicitous. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit more because we haven't gone that far. We've gone about 3 pages. So Jung then says, as can plainly be seen from Gnosticism and other spiritual movements of the kind, people are naively inclined to take all the manifestations of the unconscious at their face value, and to believe that in them the essence of the world itself, the ultimate truth, has been unveiled. So there's a way that we tend to believe what the unconscious shows to us. It appears in a certain way, and we believe that to be true, and indeed ultimately true. And then he says a very annoying sentence, which goes, this assumption does not seem to me quite as unwarranted as it may look at first sight. So he's saying that there's something to this assumption that truth has been revealed in this way. And then he says, because the spontaneous utterances of the unconscious do, after all, reveal a psyche, which is not identical with consciousness, and which is at times greatly at variance with it. So there's a way that the unconscious reveals or points to a psyche which is not identical with consciousness and is therefore in some way true. It does reveal truth in a sense. He says, these utterances occur as a natural psychic activity that can neither be learnt nor controlled by the will. The manifestation of the unconscious is therefore a revelation of the unknown in man. The manifestation of the unconscious is therefore a revelation of the unknown in man. We only have to disregard the dependence of dream language on environment and substitute, quote, eagle for aeroplane, dragon for automobile or train, snakebite for injection, and so forth, in order to arrive at the more universal and fundamental language of mythology. This gives us access to the primordial images that underlie all thinking and have a considerable influence even on our scientific ideas. Okay, again, this was rather complex, and it doesn't, to me, it's not quite clear what bearing this has on. He's just sort of talking about the nature of the unconscious now, and it's kind of like, yeah, but we were talking about this other stuff. And so he is talking about how it can be naive to take the manifestations of the unconscious at face value, but there is some truth to this because the unconscious does reveal a psyche of its own, which sort of occurs naturally and involves revelation of the unknown, which can also very much be revelation of truth. And that by substituting the terms in the way that he was talking about, we can arrive at this sort of universal language of mythology, which can help us to approach the sort of world of the archetypes that he feels that is the right level to look at things at. Okay, so from here, Jung is basically going to spend the last 5 or 6 pages of the chapter talking about the sort of implications for modern consciousness of what he's been saying. So he's been sort of using this revelation of Christ to talk about the dynamics that come from revelation. There's polarities or oppositions between higher and lower, conscious and unconscious, the sort of metaphysical upper and actual and lower, and then the church tradition and the Gnostic tradition. And he's sort of talking about the dynamics of when, when we have these experiences of revelation that seem to arise naturally from the unconscious, as he calls. What's the meaning of that? What's the effect of that? In what ways can it go wrong? In what ways can it be helpful? And yeah, what I want to do is talk about one further paragraph that expresses what he's trying to get at, and then I'll record the rest separately. So I'm trying to draw this together in some way, but it's difficult because Jung is he just talks about so much in a way that I find quite unclear. So we were talking about, you know, crucifixion, and we were talking about Peter's valedictory words, and we were talking about the Gnostic risk of inflation and how the implications of what Peter, for example, said and John's vision haven't really been recognized or understood. We were talking about the third, the natural third, which seems to arise out of the union of any different pair of opposites. But the difficulty of realizing that among the church tradition and also by the early Gnostics, and how the reality of these experiences of the self or of symbols of the self in the form of mandalas or in the form of Christ-like figures are paradoxical and beyond definition. And the best way to refer to them is using paradoxical opposites. And then he was talking more about the dynamics of conscious and unconscious. And so we understand the self as the source of these profound experiences that seem to arise naturally from the psyche, and that they have conscious and unconscious dimensions. And so in that context, Jung then talks about what's the deal with this thing that he calls unconscious? What are the dynamics that are at play when it shows itself? And so he was talking about that in terms of the theme of unity and multiplicity in conscious and unconscious, which was a little bit difficult. Well, I found it difficult. And then he was talking about these archetypal dynamics and the value of understanding the psyche through investigation of the unconscious at an archetypal level can help us to, in a sense, like remove the dross that covers our perception of the quote God image, and in this way get a clearer sense for like more faithfulness, more access, better access, greater fidelity of access to gnosis that is less interrupted or distorted, and then also understand better the impact, the implications of gnosis. And so that work is sort of for Jung the program of the whole point of psychology is to do that for the sake of the development of the individual toward wholeness, a process which he calls individuation. The idea being that the self is this transcendent center of personality that is beyond opposites, and that individuation is the process of realizing the self. So it's about bringing our wholeness, our totality into actuality, into manifestation, into realization. Okay, briefly, he says, quote, in these archetypal forms, something presumably is expressing itself that must in some way be connected with the mysterious operation of a natural psyche. In other words, a cosmic factor of the first order. So for me, I would connect this with like what he's saying is that this kind of archetypal language of the psyche is expressing a natural phenomenon which has a mysterious quality, but that is reasonably called, quote, cosmic factor of the first order because it leads to these experiences of totality, wholeness, and the unity and sense of completeness that goes along with that. Anyway, we don't have to get too hung up on it. He goes on. Quote, to save the honor of the objective psyche, which the contemporary hypertrophy of consciousness has done so much to depreciate. I must again emphasize that without the psyche, we could not establish the existence of any world at all, let alone know it. But judging by all we do know, it is certain that the original psyche possesses no consciousness of itself. This only comes in the course of development, a development that falls mostly within the historical epoch. Even today, we know of, quote, primitive tribes whose level of consciousness is not so far removed from the darkness of the primordial psyche, and numerous vestiges of this state can still be found among civilized people. It's even probable, in view of its potentialities for further differentiation, that our modern consciousness is still on a relatively low level. Okay, so again, it's a little difficult here to debride Jung from his prejudice, but the point that he's trying to make, I think, is that the psyche is that by which we know the world, and it's been greatly devalued in modern times. And he feels that there's a certain quality of self-reflective consciousness, which appears to be a product of history. And I think it's a matter of debate about whether that certain quality of self-reflective consciousness is desirable or not. In any case, we can simply observe that there have been profound changes in the dynamics of consciousness as a result of history without necessarily evaluating them. And I would say I would come back to that topic later on in Carl Jung and the Evolutionary Sciences with Gary Clark. But yes, obviously we don't have to buy into Jung's prejudice to notice that there have been these profound changes in consciousness, and the implication is that our modern consciousness is still not very developed. As he says, it's even probable, in view of its potentialities for further differentiation, that our modern consciousness is still on a relatively low level. So we've been cut off from our roots. So he goes on, nevertheless, its development, the development of consciousness, has so far made it emancipated enough to forget its dependence on the unconscious psyche. It is not a little proud of this emancipation, but it overlooks the fact that although it's apparently got rid of the unconscious, it has become the victim of its own verbal concepts. The devil is cast out with Beelzebub. Our dependence on words is so strong that a philosophical brand of existentialism had to restore the balance by pointing to a reality that exists in spite of words. At considerable risk, however, of concepts such as existence, existential, etc., turning into more words which delude us into thinking that we've caught a reality. One can be and is just as dependent on words as on the unconscious. Okay, what is Jung pointing to here? He's saying that we've freed ourselves from unconsciousness enough to forget our dependence on the unconscious, which is so ironic, by the way. He says that we feel a great pride in this development of consciousness, but that it results in a kind of dependence on words. So we become the victim of our own verbal concepts. Viveki calls this propositional tyranny. So this results in the introduction of traditions like existentialism that try to restore the balance by pointing back to the reality that exists beneath our words. And one of the great risks there is that we fall into the trap of believing that words such as existence or existential basically make us get stuck. So we're still at great risk of remaining stuck in this web of words. Case in point. Okay, then he says, Man's advance toward the logos was a great achievement, but he must pay for it with loss of instinct and loss of reality to the degree that he remains in, quote, primitive dependence on mere words. Okay, again, quite a lot of ideas in just like one paragraph. He's saying that the development of consciousness seems to go along with the development toward the logos, that there may be a sort of connection between our sense of the logos and the way that consciousness develops, that the logos may be a kind of attractive basin or teleological endpoint for consciousness itself, which is quite an interesting idea. And he feels that we developed the logos in this way, or we developed quite advanced toward the logos, but that we paid for that with loss of instinct. So there's been what you could call an advance, but it's come at a certain cost. And the result of that is that we end up being dependent on words. And we believe that the words are reality when in fact they're not. They're supposed to point to reality. He says, because words are substitutes for things, which of course they cannot be in reality, they take on intensified forms, becoming eccentric, outlandish, stupendous, swell up into what schizophrenic patients call, quote, power words. A primitive word magic develops, and one is inordinately impressed by it because anything out of the ordinary is felt to be especially profound and significant. Gnosticism, in particular, affords some very instructive examples of this. Neologisms tend not only to hypostasize themselves to an amazing degree, but actually to replace the reality they were originally intended to express. And to me, this is the issue with Heidegger. I expressed this yesterday in a very short piece of writing called The Question of the Meaning of Being. Which I may read in a second to finish this. But what is Jung talking about here? Jung's point is that we become so imbalanced in the development of our consciousness that we become very dependent on words. And words in this way, through this propositional tyranny, they end up getting a kind of magical power. We end up feeling very impressed by the power of amazing words because our reality is so constrained and boxed in that when we can express things in a kind of amazing way, anything out of the ordinary is felt to be especially profound and significant. This is a kind of substitution or poor replacement for genuine revelation. And so neologisms, this is like, for example, I mean, this is a critique of Heidegger here. I mean, obviously Heidegger's a great thinker and all, but yeah, so there's a way that when we get busy creating all of these new words, these words tend to end up they get hypostatized, they have a separate individual substance of their own, which may be illusory in a certain way. And they actually end up, quote, replacing the reality they were originally intended to express. So there's a way that, yeah, the sort of cry of phenomenology to the things themselves. There's a way that I feel that should read from the things themselves. And that by going back to the things themselves, we sort of still get stuck in being toward them. Anyway, that's a little bit too far afield. Yeah, so basically this Jung feels that there's traditions, the modern condition, which includes the existential tradition, the postmodern tradition, the phenomenological tradition, this is all kind of a result of our lack of instinct, our tendency toward hyper-differentiation within the sphere of consciousness and being cut off from the unconscious results in these traditions of which he says that a primitive word magic develops. So we get sort of sucked into quote unquote philosophizing. And this is still symptomatic of being cut off from our inner depths. So the idea that Jung is expressing is a Kantian idea that words are very much not reality. And so our dependence on those words leads to a kind of word magic, where the amazing words that we construct are taken for the reality that they're supposed to point to. And he feels that this is all symptomatic of a lack of access to reality. all symptomatic of our lack of contact with reality itself and with the unconscious as an important aspect of reality, let's say, psychic reality. And so to end this here and come back to pages 148 through 54, which continue in this vein, I might read that little piece of writing that I wrote, which describes what I mean in the context of Heidegger and phenomenology. So again, this is trying to point to one of the risks or consequences of sort of excessive philosophizing, propositional tyranny, being cut off from reality and from the unconscious, and that existentialism and phenomenology cannot adequately redress this, though they attempt to. We can see here, for example, the value of someone like Henry Corbin, who is maybe pointing to a deeper. There's something that I feel Corbin, through Islamic mysticism, sort of has access to this mythic and archetypal reality in a way that Heidegger does not. And to try and draw out what I mean, just to finish this off, so there's a little bit of a different topic, but it is definitely related to what Jung was talking about, but broadening it out. So it's the question of the meaning of being, and it's a quote from Tom Chetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin and the Angel Out Ahead, which is published in second revised edition 2021. And so on page 29 and 30, talking about Heidegger, he says, as is the case with Corbin, Heidegger's life work involves a fundamental critique of Western thought and the course of Western history. That this rather sweeping plan was intended from the start is evident even at the beginning of Being and Time. Section 6 is somewhat immodestly entitled, quote, On the Task of Destroying the History of Ontology. His hope, that is Heidegger's hope, is to provide a radical critique by getting at the roots of what it means for us to be at all. Being and Time, which is, again, Heidegger's text, is ostensibly about the question of the meaning of being. The question of the meaning of being. Then I said about this, the roots of being, of meaning, of personhood, as is obvious to anyone who can call themselves human, is sociological, not philosophical. Ontology itself is shaped and carried by the way we live. And such a way has form, indeed, contains and holds and hallows the underlying geometry of life, which hallowing predicates all thought, and which in our choice to philosophize, we fall away from. Thus we lose ourselves, forget being, abandon life. Questioning the meaning of being, it is a ridiculous, absurd, absurdly tragic questioning. Being entails its own meaning. There is nothing outside being that it may be considered to have meaning with respect to. Meaning is not had. Meaning is. Or it is not. And meaning is not, when it is not, thanks to the warding way of our life, wayward, which exhaustively misdirects itself into apoptotic, abortive, self-consuming, philosophizing questioning, only when it has already lost its way, lost its being in place, lost itself. Hence, the question both presupposes and obscures its own fulfillment, irony of ironies. It is not a question which asks to be answered. Thus, it is a luxury. I've since realized that it's quite far afield from what we were talking about, and in the phenomenological vein is rather impenetrable to anyone who's not familiar with that tradition. what do I want to say about it? Yeah, there's just a way that I've been sensitive lately to the way that Heidegger and co. in the existential and phenomenological tradition can actually obscure and lead us away from reality, away from being, in the very act of questioning its meaning. And so I feel that to question the meaning of being is a kind of luxury that comes from a quite detached stance, standpoint, orientation. And I feel that there are sort of sociological and indeed psychological preconditions for the experience of meaning. And that when we understand that, that ends up being our natural priority in a way. Quote, ontology itself is shaped and carried by the way we live. And so if we look at the way that such people live, Heidegger and all, it's a very philosophizing way to live. And I feel that that has the certain consequence of making available the questioning of the meaning of being as one of the possibilities, which is actually luxurious. Anyway, it's obviously, I'm aware of the context that Heidegger is trying to remind us of everything that we've forgotten. And so it's trying to get back to the source, but basically the criticism is that he's not getting back deep enough and that he's not noticing the psychological and sociological preconditions for the experience of meaning in being or being meaning. And that questioning that question, the question of the meaning of being comes about as a result of the lack of the forgetting of that which we are. So there's a way that I'm saying that Heidegger's questioning is in itself an expression of the forgetting of being that he himself diagnoses, which is again very ironic. Okay, well I might leave that there and try to finish off this of Jung's right now.